Welcome to Political Trade Secrets, an inside look at campaigns and politics, where we pull back the curtain, look under the hood, and investigate all aspects of politics and how elections are won. Now, here's your host, Dustin Olson.
And welcome to Political Trade Secrets. I'm your host, Dustin Olson. Thank you very much for joining us here on this fine Tuesday evening. We're going to be talking with Scott Young, the author of UltraLearning, how to master hard skills, outsmart the competition, and accelerate your career. Really looking forward to this conversation. A couple of years ago, both myself and Sean will be, actually right now he's being installed as the Grand High Poobah, or whatever they call it, for the Elks Lodge that he is a part of, and he's becoming the president basically of that. So he's not going to be here with us for this conversation. But a couple of years ago, we both read the book when it came out about how to do UltraLearning projects. And it struck us that really every single time somebody steps up in their community to run for office, to be a political leader, that they are ultimately taking on a bunch of UltraLearning projects, learning how to fundraise, learning how to work a room, learning how to do public speaking, you name it. There's all these different new skill sets that they are looking to add on into their work and as a candidate. And one of the things I was struck by that Scott Young, he took on mastering the art of computer programming by going through MIT's curriculum in a 4-year curriculum for computer programming in less than 1 year. He also took on learning 4 languages in less than 1 year. Really remarkable stuff. And how is it that he was taking on these skills and learning them in such a way that it could be maybe applied to campaigns and politics? So we reached out to Scott and we asked him to come on, and he's not thought a lot about politics, but we're going to add these different expertise, and we're going to pull it together because we really think that this is something that candidates would really benefit from. So you can check it out. This is the book right here, UltraLearning. Highly recommend that people do go check that out. I'm sure anywhere you can buy books, you can find this, and highly recommend people do check that out. Speaking of books, we have a couple of other authors coming up who are going to be on the program soon with us. We're going to be having Maurizio Veroli, Princeton professor. He's going to be telling us about how he's a real fan of Machiavelli. He's one of the few guys who actually thinks Machiavelli might have been an okay guy, but he's going to be talking about Machiavelli's advice to citizens on how to choose a leader. Ultimately, Machiavelli was a political advisor back in his day, and we're going to be learning from him on Friday with Maurizio Veroli. We're going to be talking about that. And then next week, we're going to have Michael Rechtenwald. He's going to be talking about the Google archipelago, digital gulag, and the simulation of freedom. That'll be interesting, talking about how algorithms and AI are affecting politics today, and a lot of questions I know that folks will have. And speaking of questions, wherever you are on the internet, we are live streaming on 11 different platforms right now. You can ask a question. You can join the conversation. So wherever you're at, YouTube, Twitter, any of the Facebook pages, you can post a question and you can check it out. I see we already have a couple of comments. We have a good evening. We have I'm so excited about this show. And a number of our folks, we've been promoting this program for the last couple of weeks, and a number of folks actually went out and read it and in preparation for the show. And here we go. It's on Audible too. Well, that's good to know. Thank you for sharing that. And then the other thing that I'd really like to recommend people do. So we are really here to empower citizens from across the country to be the political leaders for their community, to step up, to lead, and to speak up for their community, for their state, and for our country. And one of the ways you can do that is by taking action now. You can share this program to anyone. You can join our share force and make a difference by sharing this program to somebody out there in the public. Who knows who you might inspire to step up and run for office in their own community and the difference that they might make. And to that aim, it looks like we already have 61 shares of the program as we speak. So thank you very much to everybody who's already out there sharing the program. So let's keep upping that number throughout the show so we can make sure that people know about Scott's good work with UltraLearning and let people know about that. So please keep sharing, and thank you for that. One of the ways you can get to know about the program is also by going to politicaltradesecrets.com. We're live streaming there as well right now. and you can sign up to be a Political Trade Secrets insider and get exclusive stuff. So go to politicaltradesecrets.com. We send out a weekly insider email with all the freshest political trade secrets, and let you know all the different topics that we're tackling in the world of campaigns and politics, and how you can be more persuasive, how you can use different tactics, whether it's texting or it's direct mail, whatever it is. We have that in our emails there as well. But the way that, if you really want to have the freshest political trade secrets, and I'm sure you do, the way to do that is by joining our texting community. You can text me directly at 202-918-3345. Just moments ago, I texted out to our entire community the link to this show, so people are watching the show via the text right now. So if you want to get those kind of updates throughout the day, if there's something in the news, we want to give you our insight on what might be happening behind the headlines. We send that out to the text line. I'll be sending out a link to the book after the program. So go and check us out text us at 202-918-3345. So earlier I was talking about how both Sean and I use the book UltraLearning in order to be able to start helping our candidates learn. We're going to talk about the principles as we talk to Scott here in a moment, but we used a lot of the principles in the book to help our candidates develop these new skill sets that maybe they hadn't had before. And if you're interested in folks who are willing to take some of the most cutting edge methods and to apply them to campaigns and politics, you can join both myself and Sean at outsmart.com. We really do care about empowering those of you who are seeking to make a difference for your community, to giving you the tools, giving you the strategy, giving you the campaign plan, and all the expertise that you need to be the candidate that your community really does need. So go to olsenstrategies.com. You can also email me at dustin@olsenstrategies.com and be happy to have a consultation with you, talk through the process of deciding to run. We do that with a lot of people. Maybe it's right for you, maybe it's not. Either way, we love to help, so please do check us out. And by the way, if you really do want to be in communication with people, our other sponsor for the program is 10centtexting.com. This is the one-to-one political texting. This is probably the breakout tactic from the previous election cycle. We found that with the pandemic and everything going on, that people were yearning for human interaction, but you don't necessarily get people on the phone these days. So by texting people, you can actually have conversations one-on-one with folks. But if you'd like to check that out, go to 10centtexting.com. Well, without further ado, I'd like to bring in our guest, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. So he's a podcaster, he's an author, he's spent years writing, but and really taking on interesting projects to learn. I talked about computer programming earlier. I talked about all the languages that he learned. We're going to talk to him about some of the other things that he's done. I might get some advice from him on some of the things I could learn using UltraLearning project. I know that he used the process in order to become to learn how to draw portraits. I'm thinking about using the process on how to do impersonations, and to check that out and use the process, do something a little bit fun and interesting. But as we go into this, I see we already have a bunch of questions coming. So very good. Well, without further ado, on with the show. Scott Young, welcome to the program. How are you doing today?
Oh, it's great to be here.
Well, so I really enjoyed reading your book a couple of years ago when it came out, and I'm sure there's been many things that you've learned since then that you would add to the book to this day. But once it was published and it was out there in the public, I'm sure you started to get to hear from a lot of different folks about how they're using your methods in completely different ways than you ever imagined. And I'm guessing you may not have imagined that a political consultant would be reaching out to you and asking you, how can we use this to help people be better political candidates?
Well, like we were just talking about before the show, it's always interesting to me how many different situations there are where people, like you said, if you are running for political office and, you're not a career politician, you were doing something else before, then you have a lot of skills to learn, like you mentioned, public speaking, debate, fundraising, all sorts of things like that. And so I think this can be a really overwhelming prospect for a lot of people, that you are imagining kind of this whole new identity for yourself where you have to be proficient in all these different sorts of things. And it's, there's no class for it, right? There's
Yeah.
not like you can go to enroll in your community college and I want to be a politician and take those classes, and 3 easy steps later you're elected in office. You have to learn it the way that we learn most things, by doing and experimenting and getting feedback and researching and figuring out, what is the skill that you have to learn. So this is really why I wrote the book, was to kind of empower people to expand their identities and expand who they could become by looking at this process of learning and looking at this process of acquiring new skills in different contexts, so that you could consider something like becoming a politician just as much as you could consider becoming a programmer or a painter or learning another language.
Yeah, when I first got into politics many years ago, I discovered pretty quickly there wasn't really an education to, one, become a political strategist and to learn these things. And I went about what I called fusion strategy or comparative strategy. I went and I'd learn all these different. I learned about business strategy. I learned about military strategy. I'd learn about how people solve problems in completely different areas, and in a way, these were like mini UltraLearning projects. So I learned those, and I would try to find out what did they do that I could apply to politics, since there really wasn't an education. There wasn't a political trade secrets back then that people could go and check out. How do you run a campaign, and how do you learn these things? And I found the process of learning a bunch of different disciplines to be highly enriching, of course, but it also creates innovation. And one of the things I've been struck by, I've read your book a couple times now, one in preparation and then once when it came out. And I was struck by, I don't even know if you realize this, but you've taken on all these different disciplines. And I saw on your blog that you've also decided that you want to have at least a passing knowledge of every subject. Kind of the
It's an
modern
ambitious
Renaissance
goal,
man.
isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a
Well,
big
I
goal.
think,
Yes.
yeah, I try not to be too grandiose about it, but I think that the way I like to view it is that we live in a really interesting world where there's so many interesting subjects, and many of us kind of are a little bit straitjacketed by our own past experiences. So you say to yourself, well, I'm not good at these subjects. I'm like a math person. I'm not a languages person, or I'm no good at writing, or I'm an introvert, or we have all these labels for kind of confining ourselves into some sort of box. And this isn't to say that it's easy or necessarily even desirable to learn everything,
Yeah.
but just that this sense of possibility, this sense that, okay, well, maybe there are whole areas of knowledge that I don't know anything about that could change my views or be tools for me in a future endeavor, I think is something very potent. So I do think I'm a little eclectic. I do like learning a lot. And so that's kind of how I've shifted myself into this career where I get to talk about learning all the time and don't have to specialize quite so much. But at the same time, I think that is really core to what I think it means to, live well, is to have this sense of possibility. So even if you don't decide you want to go learn quantum mechanics or you want to go learn portrait drawing, the idea that you would know how you might approach something like that, I think is very freeing, because then you don't have this kind of straitjacketed sense of who you are.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that Sean and I talk about here is that knowing is oftentimes an obstacle to discovery when you think you know something. And by going and learning something completely new, it gives you a bit of a fresh eyes and maybe the possibility of innovation. And one of the things I saw reading your book is that, I'm not even sure if you're aware of it, but you definitely have a fresher perspective because you're pulling in ideas from chemistry into a book about learning. You're pulling in ideas from, someone who goes and becomes a world champion at Scrabble. These different things. It brings in an eclectic perspective, but it also, I think, provides for fresh ideas to maybe old challenges. It provides a different perspective, and maybe there's an insight that you have in this completely different area, kind of like Leonardo da Vinci used nature as a way to improve his designs. And you just think about any of these Renaissance folks, that they had a different perspective because they learned something about a completely different discipline. Have you found that to be the case?
Yeah, well, I think it's sort of the goal of the writer to bring in things that you weren't expecting. I mean, obviously, if I just wrote a book where every sentence was sort of you could autocorrect and just fill it in, then I'm not really doing my job. So
Yeah.
that was one of the things that I tried to do in the book, was to try to bring together as much diversity as possible, because I feel like that's why I like to read writers, is that I don't know what they're going to say next, and it's going to force me to think about things in new ways. I do think that sometimes we have an overly narrow view of learning. We were talking about this a little bit in the warm up discussion, that we have this overly scholastic view of learning,
Hmm.
and I think this really does us a disservice sometimes, because we think of, well, learning is what I did in school and I'm out of school, so I don't do that anymore. When really we're learning continuously in our lives. This is just how we cope with reality, is that we're learning. And so I think it makes sense to examine that process, because yeah, even if you aren't going to go back to school and get a PhD or something, you are still in this process of having to learn new things about the world, acquire new skills, kind of, again, this sort of renegotiating your identity. If again you're shifting from doing one thing to doing a new thing, these are all really important personal transformations that you make, and they all involve learning. So I think it really pays to study that process.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, I think we get into this dialogue where we think of learning as studying, and we think of it as like what you do to pass tests at school. And while that's probably a very important part of learning, and certainly for a phase of your life that might be the most important part, I think that it helps to have this broader perspective of, really, it's anytime you want to make changes to yourself, that's learning.
So I'm curious. It seems like the first big project you did was the MIT Computer Programming Challenge, and that's something
Yeah.
you're well known for. And but you've been writing about learning. You've been writing about these things that you've been taking on for some time. What came first, that challenge or the idea for the book? And did you use that project as a way to develop the book, or is it just because you wanted to go make that happen? How did that all come
Yeah.
about?
Well, I mean, this has a long history for me. So I did the MIT challenge. I started, it would have been almost 10 years ago, would have been when I started. So it's weird, like talking about things that, it was a decade ago that I was
Yeah.
writing about it, doing it. And even before then, I had already been in university. When I was doing my undergrad, I was already kind of writing about studying stuff. So learning was on my mind. This kind of idea of like, okay, how do you learn efficiently and effectively was something that was already on my mind. And I did the project out of inspiration from Benny Lewis, who I mentioned in the book, who had these, what he called fluent in 3 months projects, where he
Hmm.
would go to another country and in 3 months, try to learn as much as possible. And he would post these little videos after. And I was very impressed with these videos of him, like, oh, wow, like he's actually having conversations with people in 3 months in some, whether it was like Czech or Polish or whatever language he was trying to learn at the time. And this was really exciting to me because I was already blogging, and I really liked um, this process that he had of like, I'm doing it live in front of
Hmm.
you, as opposed to, I had seen some people, I think Tim Ferriss was another person who struck me, as well as Steve Pavlina, who had done these kinds of retrospective things. Like they'd done some sort of impressive feat and then they kind of talked about it after. But there was something really authentic, I guess, about I'm going to attempt this, and then this is going to be a log of my experiences. So
You
even
could
today,
you
I
could
think
fail in
people like,
public.
yeah, well, it definitely puts the pressure up to like take it seriously. But I kind of did that. I did a sort of little YouTube channel, which I still get a crazy ton of comments from people. And to me, I don't think the videos are all that interesting. It's just kind of me being like, all right, so I studied this class this week, and this is what I think you should do if you're preparing for an exam. But I think what people liked about it was, again, just this um do it yourself kind of attitude. And I think really, often I've made mistakes. Like I've done things that maybe I shouldn't have done it that way, or I only realized with 10 years more experience where I was wrong about things. But I think that kind of blogging, kind of communal, like people can see me while I'm doing it, even if it has some rough edges, I think people appreciate that. So I think that's maybe why people were drawn to the project, as opposed to if I had just like done it and then just said, oh yeah, I did that after. There was something, something to watch and participate and think about.
And let's get into some of the principles because I think what you're describing might be one of the principles. And if you'd like to just kind of
Yeah.
share with people what the various principles of ultra learning are and how they might be able to be applied.
Yeah. So, I mean, the book, I decided to divide it into 9 principles. And this isn't because there's some canonical set of 9 principles.
Hmm.
The book originally had 7, and I added 2. And I thought that there were 2 other ideas that I wanted to include. But I talk about principles because it's very easy to get in this idea of focusing on steps. Like you have to follow,
Hmm.
like, this is step 1, step 2, step 3. And that can be helpful, I think, as a guide. But I feel like it didn't really capture what I was trying to um, say, not only from the projects that I did, but all the other, diverse examples I saw. There was really no step-by-step formula people were following. Rather, there was these kind of core ideas that you saw up again and again. And so, one of the examples, which I think would be relevant to anyone here, is the first principle I talk about, which is MetaLearning, which is this idea that when we are in school, we're often given a curriculum. We are kind of a passive object that, like, this external curriculum is imposed upon. Like, okay, you are going to learn this now.
Hmm.
And you're like, okay, I'm going to do that. And I think the the process of going through school really ingrains that in you, that you think of yourself as like doing what you're told in order to learn things. Whereas an alternative process is very much, self-directed, where you're, okay, this is what I want to be able to accomplish in the real world. What do I need to learn? What do I have to do? And in some ways that's empowering because you can go out and you can learn things because you're motivated to learn them. But it can also be kind of scary because what on earth do you do? Like, how on
Yeah.
earth do I get good at public speaking? How on earth do I learn all these sorts of skills? And so this was the starting point for me in talking about the principles in the book, because I saw a real keen sense of how do you break down this really big complex skill that you want to learn, or this really, foreboding domain of knowledge, and break it down into, okay, this is what I would have to do next Tuesday in order to make progress, in order to move forward. And so that was one of the principles I have, but we can talk about them. There's 8 others. I won't, I won't
Yeah.
list them all
Yeah,
to,
no, no,
to
totally. So, as you're talking about that, one of the most applicable stories that talked about the gentleman who'd been a musician, and he went on to become
Mhm.
like the Toastmasters world champion. So that's a specific thing that a candidate thinking about running for office would be very applicable. Now, they're probably not going to go and become a world champion at Toastmasters because they're going to need to get on the campaign trail. But with thinking about the meta learning, you talk about 10% of the time of the project should be spending some time thinking about what you're going to learn and thinking about what matters, as you're just describing. Well, when it came to his ultra learning project on public speaking, what came out of that first principle and that planning process?
Yeah, so Tristan's project was really exciting for me because all the other stories I gathered, I kind of got them after the fact, right? So
Hmm.
these were, oh, I found someone who did something interesting, and then I'm trying to do some archaeological digging to figure out how they did it. Whereas Tristan was someone I knew from before, and he was like, oh, you're writing this book. I'd like to, be a guinea pig. I'd like to try a project. And we were kind of humming and hawing about what maybe he could do. And he was like, well, I like to do public speaking. I was like, okay. And I think a lot of the early discussion for us was to figure out, how do you make that into a project? Because one of the challenges of a soft skill like public speaking is that it's very nebulous and vague,
Hmm.
and it's kind of hard to pin down, okay, well, what does it mean to be good at public speaking? And obviously, if he had a particular practical consequence in mind, so if he was trying to run for office, then public speaking would be like, I'm able to win over voters to my side when I
Yeah,
am giving speeches, right? Like, this is a very
that's
clear
ultimately what you're going
metric
to
for
do.
what you want to do. But in his case, he didn't have that particular goal. He wanted to be good at public speaking, but he had kind of an open-ended set of things that he might want to apply it for. So a lot of what we spent on was figuring out, okay, how could we structure a project around it? And initially, we were thinking of trying to get him a TEDx talk, because that was sort of like, okay, this is a concrete goal that you could
Hmm.
kind of work toward, and this would be sort of okay, how do you get into that, doing that? And so he started with doing the Toastmasters because it just seemed like, okay, this would be a good starting point for learning public speaking. And it was just a few happenstance events that kind of switched him to a different goal of, oh, I could compete up these series of competitions. So basically, Toastmasters is this huge international organization. I think there's something like I don't know, there's like hundreds of thousands of members.
Yeah.
And in this particular competition, I think there's something like 30 or 40,000 people that compete. And basically it's all in these small local little things. You can imagine like an election, there's all these little
Mm-hmm.
small local elections. And then the people who win those get moved up to bigger and bigger stages.
And they all take it
he,
very seriously. I've been to a couple of Toastmasters
yeah,
meetings, and they take it very seriously.
yeah. So his accomplishments are all the more impressive because he started out very new, and I think he had some initial success going into that, and he just decided, okay, this is what I'm going to focus on, and he ended up getting in the top 10. So he wasn't the champion, but to go from like, you know, out of 40,000 applicants to is like elimination style, continually moving up, you know, to be able to get to the stage to compete for the #1 spot, I think is quite something. And so this was really exhilarating to watch on my end. And I think part of what he did was not only this kind of initial structuring, which, as I said, was a little bit more loose because he ended up pivoting and focusing on a different goal, but a lot of it was driven by the demands of what he was facing. So it's like, okay, I'm facing this particular competition, and this stuff that was like enough to get me through the last competition is not going to be good enough for this next time. So now I have to kind of design a new effort to work on a new speech, or, you know, throw this old one out and start with something new, or I got to work on a totally different aspect of my performing skills that, you know, I maybe was neglecting in a previous iteration.
And so what were the big principles from the book that he was using? Because this is the first example of somebody taking your process. And did this help hone your process also? Because he was also the first one really to take it on and go do it.
Well, I don't want to take too much credit. I don't want to say like my process, because I feel like what I've done in the book is not, you know, I have this sort of like secret method, but rather it's me trying to distill, well, what is the process that everyone uses when it works? So I don't want to take too much ownership.
Well, you get
of
credit for
UltraLearning.
putting it down in the book because no one else has done it quite as well.
But I think for me, that's what it is well, what is it that everyone does when they're learning when it works? So rather than my principles. And so I think for me, watching him go through this process, there was a few things that struck out at me. One was just the magnitude of effort that he was putting in, the amount of practice. So I think he was going like 6 speeches a week, and then sometimes like 2 a day that he was doing this was for a few months, which admittedly it's a lot of effort. Maybe you have other things you have to juggle that are not just practicing for speeches. But one thing that stuck out for me on that was that even most Toastmasters who are taking that competition seriously don't do that many speeches. They're in their individual club. They don't move from it. They, you know, maybe practice it once or twice, or they practice a lot like privately. They're not actually going and giving speeches in front of an audience. And so even just right there, it's kind of obvious, but if you're actually giving 10 times as many speeches, you're going to improve much faster than if you're, you know, doing 1 a month, let's say, which would be typical for a Toastmaster. And the other things that I think he did really well is he videotaped all his performances. And that, I think, gives a different kind of feedback, because when you are just, you know, how did you like the speech after with the audience, they're maybe not going to give you the kind of feedback you actually need to improve. Whereas for him, he was like, okay, I'm going to record myself and then I'm going to dissect what I did. Oh, that didn't work there. That joke that I thought maybe was funny. No, not funny. No one laughed, or that was awkward, or I did these things that I didn't like. And so this kind of feedback, I think, is very interesting, because we often think of feedback as coming from like an external source. Again, this is this school analogy of like it's a teacher grading you and giving you an A or a B or a C. Whereas this was very different, because it was, okay, I'm going to look at my own performance and kind of go through it with a fine-tooth comb. And one other thing he did, which I thought was really important in the end, which is not something that everyone has access to, but he got a coach. And so he managed to connect with this guy, Michael, early on. And they, you know, formed a friendship and a bit of a partnership. And Michael was a bit more senior in the Toastmasters organization, but, you know, saw Tristan's enthusiasm and was like, okay, I want to help you. I want to help you achieve this goal. So I think getting people to buy into your projects, people who can mentor you, foster you, support you, give you guidance is very helpful. Not so much even for the explicit content of that advice, but just as a structuring sort of process, that if you're just doing something entirely on your own and it doesn't have any of that other kind of support or other factors, it can be harder to, you know, take it to the finish line and continue working on it aggressively.
Yeah, and on that, the feedback in particular, one of the things that candidates, so you decide to run for office and you get out there and maybe running for Congress, or you're in Canada, maybe they're running for Parliament or wherever, whatever they're doing, and you start to get lots of feedback. You get feedback from, Mildred down the block, who thinks your campaign ads are great or terrible or whatever, but you just get a lot of feedback. And one thing that you address in the book, and interested in your thoughts here, because candidates do get a lot of feedback. They're out there in the public. They get um, they get good feedback, they get bad feedback. How do you actually sift through that and not have the feedback? Um, how do you get the signal from the noise, as I think you
So
put it?
this was something that I kind of only realized a little later after publishing the book. Not that I regret anything that I wrote in the book, but the connotation of feedback, again, because of this sort of school-driven metaphor, is like someone else telling you what you did right and
Mhm.
wrong. And
Yeah.
when I actually look at the examples, that it's actually kind of misleading, because that's often the worst kind of feedback to get.
Yeah.
That someone telling you what you did right and wrong is like highly suspect. It has
Yeah.
all these problems with it. Now, there are certain kinds of like exemplar cases where it works. So, the classic example is like the football coach telling you how to, like, throw a pass or something. Like, they're watching you, they're an expert, they have the ability to coach. They're not even just skilled themselves. And so we tend to use that model of feedback of like, well, that's what it means to get feedback. Whereas a term that I'm kind of using more recently, which I find fits better with what I meant by feedback in that chapter, is this kind of direct contact with reality.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so the problem is that we often in our practice of our skills are not in direct contact with the reality that we care about. We have this kind of distance between what we're doing and what we actually care about. And because of that gap, it's very easy to kind of get out of sync with what really matters. So I think with politics, in this case, the reality you care about is usually, whatever political values got you into this in the first
Mhm.
place, and getting elected, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's those two things for the most part.
Pretty
And
straightforward.
so someone's random opinion about your ad is maybe not what really matters. What really matters is, does the ad, support the actual things you care about, your values in politics, and is it going to help you get elected? And so I think the more we can design our efforts to get in contact with that reality, I think is very important. And so there's various mechanisms for doing that, and it varies depending on the exact project. But some people employed kind of an aggregating approach. So they, again, instead of taking one person's feedback, you get like a survey with a lot of people, and then that can kind of compress the noise and get, whatever the average is. Sometimes it's from doing prototypes or little tests, right? So, you're doing some sort of smaller scale version of what you care about, seeing what the results are, and then using that to extrapolate about the whole. In other cases, it can just be from, like the physical environment will tell you whether or not you are doing a good job. So, as I mentioned, if you are drawing a picture, for instance, you can just look at it and be like, does this look good or not?
Yeah.
So I think there's lots of different ways you can get feedback, but I think, again, viewing feedback primarily as coming from a teacher or a coach is maybe the wrong way of doing it, because that's sort of the exceptional case where
Yeah.
that works. The more general case is this direct contact with the reality you care about.
So it sounds like you need to be clear about what your intention is ultimately, and having methods to be able to see if you're out of sync with that. Well, that's very helpful thinking about that, because we're ultimately coaches in a way. That's
Mhm.
partly what we are doing. And one of the things that's key to the ultra learning process is that it's self-directed. And I think that's one of the big messages of the book. And we talked before we came on. You're a new father, and you have a portion of the book, when you come to the end of the book, you talk about um, ultra learning and helping others. And there's a specific family where all three of the daughters became top notch chess players, and the father, Laszlo, you have to remind me his last name, but
Polgar, yeah.
Polgar, he was insistent on creating geniuses, and there's really no way to know if it wasn't just genetics, but he created geniuses. So I asked you the question: are you going to create a genius? But the only reason I ask this question now is
Yeah.
for us as political consultants, we're helping people through this process, and they're coming to us to learn how to do whatever it is better that they need to do: fundraising, public speaking, doing interviews with news media, etc. They're coming to us to do that. So, what's the advice for someone who's really trying to help another person? In your case, as a father now, and my question is: are you going to create a genius? Are you going to take on that process?
Well, so the way that I kind of parsed together all the stories that end up in the book was not by some idea that like all of these conform ideally to how I would do things, but rather
Mhm.
like, isn't this neat? Shouldn't we look at
Yeah.
this? And so the Polgar story struck me because all of the examples that I had focused on in the book were usually of adults pursuing some aim that they had. And, the obvious connection whenever you talk about learning is that, well, I want to teach my kids to learn various things. And so the Polgars kind of provided this very unusual case of someone taking this radically different approach to education and being kind of kooky about it too. Like if you
Yeah.
read this guy's thoughts, it's like, oh, this guy's a nut. But the but he actually did it, right? Like he did what he set out to do. So it's just sort of like, okay, we need to study this. Now, my own sense, and we were talking about this before, my own sense is that a person's personal autonomy is very important, and that's a theme that I really try to emphasize in the book. That ultra learning is something you do, is something you do to someone else, right? And I think that's where sometimes I get questions where people just try to flip it that way of like, well, how should we change all our schools to make everyone ultra learners? And it's like, well, you don't make people an ultra learner. You choose to take on an inspiring learning project, and that would be what I would talk about. And so I think a better model is more, how can you provide resources to someone so that they can take on the projects that they're really interested in? And
Yeah.
obviously, a 3-year-old, when this sort of experiment started, is maybe not going to have really complicated notions of becoming a chess grandmaster. But I think even we don't give children enough credit for having their own ideas and initiatives of things they'd like to do and become and work on. And I think we tend to just invoke kind of a top-down model of like, well, this is what you're going to do and this is what you're going to improve. And so I think my idea of not just education for my son, but also in the general scheme of like, how would I talk to teachers and educators and coaches, is to ask, how can you bring out the self-directed quality of a person's own learning? How can you be a resource for them to accomplish their goals? And I think that's a very different kind of role as a facilitator than being something that we again typically associate with a curriculum where it's like, okay, here's what I'm going to make you learn, and I
Yeah.
like, how do I like carrot and stick you into doing that? And I think it's a very different process to be like, okay, you've come to me as a whole person that has all these ideas and things that you want to accomplish and dreams and an identity, and how do I help you do that? How do I facilitate that? And so even Tristan de Montebello, who we've been talking about with the public speaking, he took that experience and went on to form a speaking consultancy, which I think is very interesting because he's sort of trying to flip that role of, well, how do I get people who want to be really good speakers? How do I kind of structure that rather than, okay, I'm going to open a school and force everyone to become good public speakers? It's very much a process of facilitation.
Yeah, well, that's great advice, and I appreciate that, because that is ultimately what we seek to do is to flip that so we can help it. I'm going to go to the audience and see. We have quite a few questions here, and I don't know if I can even get to half of them. Okay, let's see. Um, Okay, this is an interesting question. This is maybe a little bit more towards me, but I'm going to flip it so that it's towards you. What is more important, fundraising or public appearances? It seems name recognition is worth more than monetary differences. Well, money helps you get name recognition, so that's the first part of that answer. But it goes to the question of fundraising. So this is something that everybody who runs for office, at least in the United States, you have to be able to raise money in order to get your message out. And it also is an indication of your ability to win people over to your cause, to get people to take some kind of action, whether it's volunteering or fundraising. So this is the thing that most candidates dread, but they know that it's necessary for them to win. One of the things that we work with people is the mindset is a big part of it. If you think it's terrible, it's going to be terrible. But if you were all of a sudden you just decided you wanted to take an ultra learning project for fundraising, what would it be? Or if I said that's what I want to do, what would you start to talk to me about, like how to design an ultra learning project around fundraising?
Yeah, well, the nice thing is that if you're in a situation where you have to fundraise, the kind of like, well, how should I practice fundraising is pretty easily solved. You go out and you fundraise, right?
Yeah.
So I think the first step again goes to this meta learning idea. How can you break apart the project into what is involved in fundraising? What do I have to get good at? So you could rent out some books, or you could, follow a program such as yours to get some of this basic scaffolding of like, okay, what is involved in fundraising? And then the idea I would say is, and this is something that's true, I think, of a lot of cases where there's a skill that I kind of don't like, that I'm not good at this, or I don't
Yeah.
like it seems like an obstacle to what you're doing. I think in some cases, it's almost better to get obsessive about it. So
Yeah.
it's almost better to have the opposite, where like if I kind of dislike it, then it's like, okay, let's just like overkill, figure out how this fundraising thing
I
works.
love it.
And it's kind of counterintuitive, because I think once you really start to study something in detail, you develop an interest for it. You develop an interest in how it works. And so, I can even think about that for myself when I was publishing my book and I was getting involved in marketing it, which is not the same thing as fundraising, but it has a kind of similar
Yeah.
feeling, is that I enjoyed doing the research and I enjoyed doing the writing. But the marketing was something that I was like, oh, geez, now I have to go like write to people and like see if they'll, feature my book or do this kind of thing.
Hmm.
And so one of the things I think that really helped was taking a very direct approach at that. It's just being like, okay, this is going to be my project for the next, 6 months. It's just marketing this book. Let's focus on like everything I can do to get really good at it. And that kind of ironically took a lot of the anxiety out of it, because I was just kind of, in the back of my head, I got to do
Yep.
this marketing and I hate that. And, are going to feel awful for that whole period of time. Whereas if I take it as, okay, here's a puzzle I have to solve that's necessary for me to solve to move forward, then you start playing with the puzzle a little bit. And you're like, oh, this is actually more interesting than I thought it was. And, maybe, yeah, I do care about, the content of my ideas and not the marketing of them. But, this is interesting. I didn't realize that, okay, that's the thing that matters and not this. And I need to work on this and stuff. And so I think you discover those things, I think, once you start to really get interested in it.
Well, one of the things you write about in the book is that people don't necessarily innately have an interest or a passion, right, for any topic necessarily. People, or there's some research that shows that you start to develop that interest and passion based on developing some expertise in it. So there's a necessity for the ultra learning projects to get into it, to be able to break through that. Am I pulling up the right information, or is that what would you say?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is a big argument of Cal Newport's book, So Good They Can't Ignore You, which I'm a fan of as well, of
Yeah.
his idea that, we don't have innate passions, or at least not ones that like correspond to professional activities generally. And so this idea that once you develop skill, then that actually leads to sort of a more satisfying relationship with the activity you're doing, I think is true of a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about as well. And researchers who study curiosity find that there's this kind of positive feedback loop quality to it, that the more you learn about something, the more curious you are about it. And
Yeah.
it seems to be partly just because whenever you learn something, you don't just learn the thing, you also kind of inadvertently open up this sort of extra questions in space that wasn't there before. So it's a little bit like, as you fill in some parts, you're kind of filling in some parts of a piece of paper, but the paper gets bigger as you're doing it. And so the perspective of like, oh, well, there's also this, and there's also this, there's also this. And so I think the obsessive kind of like, okay, I don't really like it, but I'm going to like really just learn everything there is to know about this, and, start practicing and start working on it. Once you get into that, the gears start turning, and then it becomes a lot easier, I think.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to fundraising, there's fundraising phone calls, which is everybody's favorite, to call 80 to 100 people a day, maybe, which is a lot of opportunities for directness, the ability to just get in there and do it. You have to plan a lot of time. And oftentimes for candidates, they're spending 8 hours a day just on the fundraising phone calls. But then you have giving speeches to have people raise money. You have asking people to be part of your finance committee. There's a whole bunch of different things. So what you would do in the meta learning, I'm guessing, is pick one area to focus on maybe, and then go about having drills or having practice or having, breaking it down further?
Well, I think what you said is very telling too. That if you're spending 8 hours a day um, on the fundraising calls, I think that first of all, by just exposure, removes your fear of like calling the next one if you've done 100 already today. But then the thing I would be working at is that once you establish some kind of baseline for how you're performing, it would be okay, well, what am I doing wrong? What can I improve? And I think once you are already engaged in a practice, then that's when there's all these opportunities for either like theory of like learning more about like how should I structure my
Yeah.
calls, or okay, I have these little verbal tics that I need to like work on, or my problem is that I jump too quickly into talking about X and I need to spend more time talking about Y, or even just these dimensions of what you're doing. So I'm spending too much time talking, I'm not listening enough, or I'm spending too much time doing this and not enough of that. And so I think there's two challenges when you talk about a project like this, is that first, there's the problem of making sure you're just getting enough raw practice, which for a lot of people, I imagine, maybe they're just not doing as many fundraising calls as they should be doing. Right.
Yeah.
And then
They're definitely
that's a
lying
different
to their
problem.
consultants, I'm pretty
That's a
sure.
different that's a different problem. But then there's also the problem of you're doing a lot of calls and maybe you're not doing that well at them. And so I think this split between the getting enough of the raw practice and then okay, well, what do I do with the raw practice? I think it's important to separate those problems, I think, because it's very easy to get into the mindset of how can I finesse and optimize when I'm doing like 3 calls a day? And then it's just, well, that doesn't really matter, right?
No.
Tristan Vonabella only got good at speaking because he's speaking 6 times a week. And then only then does it make sense to start like nitpicking your performance.
That's awesome. Well, thank you very much for that guidance. I already have a few new ideas for how to get better at it myself, even from just that conversation. I think it's you could apply it to working a room. You could apply it to doing press interviews, all these different areas, and really taking it on as UltraLearning projects could make it a lot more fun. And that's one of the things you talk about. I think Principle 9 is experimentation. When you get to that level of mastery, that you're kind of playing with it, you're exploring. And then also one place that I also really like that you brought in Richard Feynman, the great physicist, and how he was just so curious about the things that he was figuring out and how he would really get into it. The people who do really well in politics, whether people like it or not, are the people who really get interested in the little things like the fundraising and maybe even the issues. And they may not talk about every intricacy of the issues to all the voters, but they just get really interested in it and they love finding out more about it.
I think that's true of a lot of domains where there's people who, like a lot of practices have this kind of content and then the business of the content, right? So you can even imagine what I'm doing right now. I'm an author, and so I have my ideas, but then I also have the kind of work of being an author and running a website and having a business. And similarly, as a politician, you maybe have some values that you want to express in the world politically, but then there's the kind of mechanisms of politics and there's business and what have you. And I don't remember who told me this, but they made a comment that like the only people who are really, really successful at something are usually people who don't just like the kind of content of whatever their life is, but they enjoy, appreciate, and at least kind of see it as an interesting challenge, the kind of surrounding activity for it. So the people who really like science but really hate being, an academic and working in a lab don't tend to be great scientists. And similarly, the people who, they have a passion for something, but they just hate all the things that you have to do to actually get it done, really, it becomes a problem as well. So I mean, it's hard to change exactly what you like about things, but I think if you know that, then you can at least in the back of your head be like, okay, well, understanding the process and getting curious about the process and maybe even digging deeper into it to ignite that passion, I think is very important.
One of our viewers mentions, and it looks like they read the book, the guy that made the video game and became a millionaire worked on his weakness and then became a video game designer. Say a little bit about that, attacking your weakness, because that's kind of what we're getting at here is like if it's a weak point, but it's necessary, you just have to get after it.
So this was Eric Barone, and he published the game Stardew Valley, which I think it sold like tens of millions of copies now. It was even less when
Wow.
I actually wrote the book, but he's set for life now. And he was someone who really inspired me because he basically just had this vision that he's going to make this game entirely by himself, which I don't think it's hard to really appreciate how difficult that is if you've never tried to do anything like that before, but you really have to be quite multi-talented to pull that off because it requires visual art skills, music skills, programming skills, business skills. Like it requires so many things that are like totally unrelated to each other to be able to put those all together. So very, very few solo efforts now make it happen. And I decided in the book to focus on something that he thought he was bad at, which was doing the visual art. Now, of course, he had to learn lots of skills. So he also had to work on the music and the programming and everything, but he struggled with the visual art in the game. And I think this is interesting because the obvious answer for what he should have done is that he should have hired someone to do the visual art. Like that would have been the obvious solution. And so from an economic point of view, obviously specialization makes sense. Don't focus on your weaknesses, hire someone else to do it. And I think there's a truth to that logic. However, I think there's two kind of counters to that. One is that sometimes you can't outsource your weakness.
Yeah.
So as you know, I'm not sure whether you would agree with what I was saying, but typically as the candidate, maybe you can't outsource your fundraising. So if you hate doing that, you're kind of stuck with it. Similarly, for me with this book, I can't outsource the marketing. So if I, struggled with the marketing, then the book is just going to suffer for that. I can't, I have to be the one going on podcasts like these to talk about the book. I'm the one who has to try to convince other people that it's worth reading. And so in those cases, then your weakness can actually be much more important than your strengths because it becomes the bottleneck for you going forward. And so I have a whole chapter in the book where I talk about doing drills, which can, usually often refers to a more specific aspect of a skill. But similarly, you can think of whenever something is unavoidable, if it's the weakest part of what you're doing, it will often drag down your total efforts. The other thing I think, which is also the case, is that there's a different mindset involved in improving one's weaknesses than working on one's strengths. And I think that, not to say that I like working on the things that I'm good at too. And I think, for hobbies and stuff, I don't think doing something you hate is necessarily good. But I think there is a useful skill in kind of knowing kind of at the higher, more abstract level, how do I learn something that I'm not interested in? Or how do I learn something that I'm bad at? Because if you, again, only learn things that you were already really good at, that kind of straitjackets you. So I think it's part of the kind of UltraLearner toolkit, if it were, to have this ability to be like, okay, I'm not really good at this, but how can I be okay? Or how can I make it so that it doesn't, handicap me unduly? And so I do think that's important, even if you end up spending a lot of time focusing on the things that you enjoy and you are good at and contribute to your kind of comparative advantage.
Well, I think is a really great point to bring into, I guess, the whole conversation on learning and career development and whatnot. Because for a long time, the Strengths Finder test was a big thing. Gallup had their whole Strengths Finder thing, and the whole thing was about focus on your strengths. And I think people can get some mileage out of that. But if you have, I can't remember the term that you use, but it's that from chemistry, right?
Yeah, the rate determining step.
Yeah, the rate determining step that, and fundraising is definitely that for a candidate. If you don't want to call people, if you don't want to do the marketing for your book, your neat ideas are not going to get out there in anybody else's head. So it's just not going to happen. So I think it's really important to bring back into this larger public conversation about career development. You mentioned Cal Newport, who apparently he wrote the intro to your book. Is that right? Or he was involved in
No, James Clear wrote the intro to my book. Cal Newport had a lot of influence on my book. He didn't write the intro. He did review it, but Cal was the person who coined the term UltraLearning. So this is not even my term. This is just, I wrote an article after the MIT challenge, and he described it as UltraLearning, and then that just kind of carried away. So I can't even claim credit for the term.
Well, those are by the way, in the marketing of your book, with marketing your book, you did a great job with both of those authors and having them be a part of it. But I think those kind of contrarian views, and maybe it's not contrarian, but different view than just focus on your strengths or just follow your bliss, or those things that aren't necessarily going to bring. They might sound good, but they're not necessarily going to
Well,
get you what you want.
if I can kind of express a somewhat more abstract point, the problem is that anytime you reduce something to a slogan, it's going to be too low resolution to deal with the complexities of the world. So I don't think the problem, following your strengths, is often a really good idea, especially with the logic of specialization. But I think you do need to deconstruct it a little bit, right? So in the deconstruction is that, well, if you have to do the thing you're weak at, then it's often probably better to improve that than to do something else. So I think the logic of focusing on your strength is, well, if you can make a weakness irrelevant, do that. But if you can't, if it's going to be relevant to what you're doing, then my prescription would be, well, then you might as well get good at it.
That's excellent. Well, as we begin to wrap, I'm curious. It's been almost 2 years since the book came out. I'm guessing that you've had lots of conversations with folks like me who are using this in all sorts of different venues and different disciplines. And I'm guessing also through that time period, you've mentioned a few things already, that you have to get the book out there. But anytime you have mental models, or you have a process, you have anything that you've created, and you have your intellectual output, you always want to make edits. So I'm guessing in the last 2 years, there's been things that have come up that you would add to the book, or you might take away. And then also there's been people who've used this in some brilliant ways that you would love to put in the book. Pick a couple of things that you think you would like to add, or places people have used it that have been interesting.
Well, I think one benefit of spending about 10 years thinking about a book before you write it is that the ideas have a longer half-life. So in this case, I don't think I would make major changes to the book. I think there's ideas that I didn't consider in the book that might be good for another book, or ideas that, well, this is actually a much deeper topic than I was able to give credit for in the book. I think that one of the ideas that I want to explore more is basing this sort of on directness, because I think in the book, I took a somewhat ambivalent attitude towards the school-based learning and kind of how it pertains to skills. But I think in the time since, I've just sort of realized how much many of our ideas about learning are kind of based on this going to school metaphor, that it really does make all the learning that we have to do just sort of seem less important in contrast. And so that's something that I definitely want to dig into deeper. But I mean, I did touch on it in the book. It was just a much smaller section than maybe I would if I were thinking about it today. And I think the other thing I got from the book was all these people who, not only people who, after reading the book, took on some project to learn something new, but people who told me about a story that was like, oh yeah, I did that, and I did it for this. And I was like, oh man, where were you when I was doing research? That would have been perfect. When I was like, searching, wide and far to find these people, and then they come out when you write the book. So there's a little irony in that the research becomes a lot easier after the book has been published.
Well, I imagine the research for your next book will be all the more easier. Frankly, with the directness work. And that's what you're thinking about, is that's maybe the next book, is that you're going to be doing something along those lines. From the various aspects of campaigns and politics, if we're able to help provide examples and stories of people who are doing stuff that can apply it, we'd love to do that.
Well, I think, just even having this conversation is good for me, because learning politics and becoming a politician is so different from how you learn things in school, that it's just been interesting to me to hear how you experience it and how a lot of your clients have experienced it. Because really, it is the case that a lot of people who have had so many years of formal education just don't even know how to structure projects like this, or how to approach learning something like that.
Now, I have to ask this question because I just realized I hadn't asked it yet, because this is really the challenge. You decide to change. It's basically a career change. You're going to run for office. You may still be a lawyer. You still may be a small business owner, but you're going to go and you're now going to do public speaking. You're going to do fundraising in different formats. You're going to be learning how to work a room. You're going to be learning a little bit about marketing yourself, because you want to make sure that they're not stealing your money for the campaign budget, whoever's running that. So you're going to have to learn all these different things. You're going to have to learn a bunch of issues. You're going to have to get into to those and figure out what matters and what doesn't. there's a bunch of ultra learning projects all at once, and um, that kind of short circuits that principle too, the focus.
Mm.
Like you don't really get to focus. You're doing a bunch of things at once. Any advice that you would have for someone who kind of has to take on a bunch of ultra learning projects?
Well, focus in this way doesn't mean do only one thing. I think that I think what I would say is that, when you're running for office, you have a very concrete project that your goal is to get elected, right?
Yeah.
And so in any project, there's going to be lots and lots of different things that you have to do and lots of different things that you have to learn. And so I think that the idea here is to, oh, excuse me, is to use that as your, oh, right at the end, my water runs out.
Yeah, no worries.
Oh, excuse me. Use that as your kind of, your guiding principle there of, well, this is what I'm trying to accomplish. And so that's how I'm going to organize my efforts.
Awesome. Well, very good. Well, people can go to scottyoung.com to check out the book. You can go to anywhere they sell books. I'm sure people know where to find books these days, and you can purchase the book. But it's really been awesome having you on and having this conversation, and it really has been a great book for us and our consulting practice, and for us to develop new skills. I learned how to do game design. I am going to go and learn how to do impressions. That's my next ultra learning project. So I don't know if people in the comments want to give recommendations as to celebrities, politicians that I can learn my impressions for. Please do suggest those. But Scott, thank you very much. Any last comments you'd like to make before we?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, it's been great talking to you and hearing for all these stories. Of course, anyone who wants to check me out can go to my website, scottychung.com, check out the book. And I know that there were people watching live or maybe watching the recording later who had questions that we weren't able to address. Feel free to email me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And on with the show. Well, that was a heck of a lot of fun, and thank you to everybody for your comments and questions. We had quite a few, and I don't know if we're going to be able to get to all of them, but I will, after the program, I will go and I'll text people. If you want to go to our text line right now, I will share that with everybody. We will text questions and answers after the program, so you can text me at 202-918-3345. You'll get a text back that gives you a link. You opt in, you click the link, you opt in, and then from then on, it's text directly from me and from Sean, so we can answer your questions as you have them, and we'll be able to answer those. And as Scott said as well, you can go to his website, scottyoung.com, and he would love to hear from you. And do go check him out and check out his book. I have the international version for some reason. That's what Amazon sent me. But normally the book is green, I think, in North America. But do go check this out. It's an excellent book. Whatever you're doing, even if you're not thinking about running for office, you have something in your career, in your just in your life that you'd like to take on. Go take it on. Create an ultra learning project. I have had a heck of a lot of fun. I've shared this on the program before. I've developed an expertise in game design, and that's based off of this book. That was one of the projects that I took on is to learn how to do game design, and created a number of games along that. And then we even use that on our campaigns to make it a little bit more fun. So check it out. There's all sorts of different things you can do. The world is your oyster. I highly recommend that. But thank you very much to Scott for being on the program. Really do appreciate it, and wish him the best of luck in everything he's doing going forward, and the difference that he makes with these ideas and sharing them with the world. So do go check all of that out. Now, I wanted to make sure that we mentioned one of our other sponsors, Grassfire LLC. If you need canvassing, petitioning, or live calling, this is there on the doorstep, there in front of the grocery store, there on the phone, the person-to-person contact that your campaign needs in order to make sure that you are putting your best foot forward. That, if you're running for U.S. Senate, you're running for governor, you're running for Congress, you're running for state legislature, it's very likely that you're not going to actually be able to speak with every single person in your district or in your state. you're going to have people who are qualified, they're high level, that are highly well trained, that are going to be your best foot forward, and they're going to be the ones who actually be probably the only representative of your campaign, whether you're trying to get on the ballot through petition or you're making sure that you're getting your message door to door or by phone. Do check out Grassfire. You can go to grassfire.us, schedule a complimentary consultation, and do check that out. Again, also, we're sponsored by my firm, Olson Strategies. You can go to olsonstrategies.com, and then we're also sponsored by tencent-texting.com. Best way to get your message directly to voters and is by text through Rich Media. Do check that out today. Well, thank you to everybody for your comments and questions today. We really do appreciate it. If you'd like to be a fellow or intern with us, you can check us out at olsonstrategies.com. You can send me an email at dustin@olsonstrategies. We've had a number of new interns and fellows join us in the last few weeks, and it's really, really making a difference. They're helping empower citizens from across the country to be the political leaders that their communities need and their state need and our country needs. So please do, if you know anybody who would like to get into politics, would like to learn how to be a political leader, please do connect them with us. With that, thank you very much to everybody for being here today and joining us for this important conversation. We really do appreciate you being a part of this. Thank you to everybody who shared the program. It looks like we are approaching 100 shares, so that is pretty amazing. A couple of great comments. Thank you, Scott. You are so generous. That's an awesome comment. We have, thank you. I enjoyed my first visit to your podcast. Well, thank you, Jeffrey. We appreciate that. And this is an UltraLearning campaign book. Brilliant. I think that was our offer to help. And then great show, fellas. Quite a few comments here, so thank you very much. We will follow up after the show on the text line to all of your great comments today. Thank you very much. Go to politicaltradesecrets.com to sign up to be a Political Trade Secrets Insider so that you don't miss out on any of the great political trade secrets, and we can keep you in this community making a difference. With that, thank you very much, and have a great day.
Join us next time by subscribing on iTunes and get show notes and sign up for our newsletter at politicaltradesecrets.com.